Imagine for a moment that you're playing in the biggest game of your life, a $1 million buy-in cash game streaming before the largest audience ever in the history of poker. Now imagine that you're stuck $300,000 and look down at pocket aces from the small blind. So you 3-bet and are called by a crypto whale. You then go bet, bet, bet through a relatively clean runout. Villain proceeds to go into the tank as you pray for a call. But suddenly, all of your dreams are twisted into a nightmare when Villain shoves his $1 million stack back into your face. What do you do? This was the dilemma facing Doug Polk during his recent appearance on Hustler Casino Live, and in this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the mind of a monster, comparing his thought process to that of the machine, starting back at the very beginning.
I'm pushing a lot for big ante online and live.
It's way better. It's more fun.
Punishes the nits and VIPs aren't playing out of position.
The most aggressive guy just picked up the number one.
Lost out of position. Right. The direct, yeah?
And Hank has a very strong hand himself. Ace Jack Suited is just doing poorly against this one hand.
Come on, everyone has an extra bet, Hank.
What's up?
Folds me the small blind. I look down at the pocket aces. I'm always going to be 3-betting this hand. Building this pot, got the nuts. It's time to build this pot, and hopefully someone gets a little spicy here. Maybe Hank tries to put another re-raise to get a button pre-flop. Either way, Tom Don gets out of the way. Back over to Hank, Ace Jack suited. I think this is a hand that you mainly want to be calling. Every once in a blue moon, you could 4-bet.
So we're playing 500 1K with a 3K big blind ante, and for purposes of our analysis, we're just going to ignore Tom's limp. And based on this custom sim, aces are a pure raise from the small blind, and ace jack suited is mostly a call from the hijack, which is consistent with Doug's analysis. Now, one overarching thing to note here, which Doug mentions, is the fact that this hand occurs while the stand-up game is in effect, where the last person to win a pot has to pay all the other players $6,000. Obviously, this increases your incentive to play more pots, especially when you get closer to being the last one to win a hand. But from a game theory perspective, there is no solver that can calculate this dynamic, and it can be dangerous to attempt to manually alter ranges accurately. Perhaps one way to account for this would be to just shift your strategies in the edge cases, but this becomes less important as the pot gets bigger on later streets. So we're just going to analyze this hand using a straight GTO analysis, and Doug indicates that for the most part that was his approach, other than perhaps expanding Hank's pre-flop range a bit.
Everyone just thank you for that, Hank.
65,000 in the middle. Whatever sizing Doug chooses is the right sizing.
23.
So rainbow flop. This is a board you're going to be betting a lot as the pre-flop raiser. I do decide to go ahead and bet, and I bet about 1/3 pot here. A little bit more actually. I think I might have set a miscount on the pot, but anyway, at 23,000 on the flop on Queen 4-3 Rainbow. And I think this makes a lot of sense. I would anticipate Hank to be floating the flop, to be calling pre-flop with a lot of hands, trying to get out of the stand-up game. And then also considering that we are $1 million deep, a lot of implied odds here if he hits a big hand, and if he wants to try to make moves post-flop, a lot of opportunities to do so. So this is a pre-flop spot where I think you will have a lot of hands, and I think you're going to want to be betting at a high frequency on a board like this where my range is simply much stronger than Hank's is.
So Doug makes a relatively small bet with his aces, which is solver approved, and his inclination of wanting to bet at a high frequency in this spot due to his significant range advantage is also consistent with the sim. One thing that Doug doesn't really get into is whether he considered using other c-bet sizings in this spot, which is a factor that can become more important the deeper you get. You see, the solver is a greedy bastard, meaning that its bet sizes usually will be heavily influenced by the most efficient path of getting stacks in by the river with its strongest hands. So if you compare this sim, which has an SPR of 16, to a sim with the exact same parameters and ranges but with an SPR of around 4, which is more typical for a 100 big blind 3-bet pot, we see that the overbet is not used at all when the stacks are shallow, whereas it is used around 20% of the time when very deep. Generally speaking, the deeper you are, the more stratified bet sizings tend to become, with your absolute strongest hands having a greater incentive to accelerate growing the pot, and your mediocre hand having a greater incentive to pot control, which is also reflected by the checking frequencies.
And that's going to bring Hank in with the backdoor flush draw.
And over to Hank now with the backdoor nut flush draw. He's got to at least call. I think every now and then getting in a raise isn't too shabby. You do block a bunch of the value I could have to bet this flop, like aces, ace queen, queen jack suited, jacks, all those kinds of hands that I could have for value in the flop. You block a lot of them, and of course you're going to have some great equity, and you're going to get some reasonable turns to barrel, especially obviously diamonds, but even a king or a 10 could be some reasonable bluff cards for you as well.
Obviously, Rico's just going to lose, right?
And he now has the nut flush draw. I'm going to say 75. 81.
But basically now when I'm on this turn, we get a brick turn after betting the flop. Typically speaking, we like to go about 2/3 ish pot or so, and the idea being we bet the flop high frequency with a lot of hands. On the turn we bet a smaller range with a bigger size, and we're going to be barreling a decent amount on the river. When I think about hands for value, you definitely want to have all of your hands like king, queen, or better are going to be in here. King, queen might do a bit of checking, but will mainly bet. Ace, queen is going to mainly bet, and then aces and kings are going to be primarily betting.
So it appears that Doug is mainly using a one-size strategy here, which is a pretty common adaptation to GTO that many resort to, including myself, because it can be very difficult to split up your range into multiple sizings with any sort of accuracy. That being said, one of the benefits of using a smaller sizing, as the solver does with decent frequency here, is that it allows you to expand your betting range with weaker hands. As we can see, when the smaller third pot size is used, you're allowed to continue firing with hands like top pair, weak kicker, and under pairs to target the lower pairs and weaker draws in villain's range. And this can be a particularly useful tactic when out of position, deep stacked, with a certain class of hands, because the in-position player's advantage and realization is amplified when the SPR increases. But if you play a more polar strategy with a 3/4 pot bet or check, villain needs to fold more of its range in response, and as a result, there's a lower probability that hero's mid-strength hands will be called by worse. So in this case, when betting larger, the cutoff point for value is right around king-queen, as Doug mentioned.
A friend of mine's coming here, called Michael Kim, the owner of GG. I'm telling him he should be using big answers online.
Okay, over to Hank. No flush draw. I really like calling here in Hank's shoes. Excuse me. I think that if he calls and he pairs, then his pair outs are going to be pretty clean. If he raises and gets re-raised, it's a disaster. And he obviously also has position, so he's going to make sure to realize his equity well on the river if he does call. If Hank wanted to bluff here, he could use a hand like ace-5 suited, if he didn't forward about that. 6-5 suited, that would make a lot of sense. Maybe if he had something that kind of unblocked, you know, if he did float like jack 10 of clubs on the flop, something like that could make some sense. Although at that point your hand's pretty weak, it's a little suspect. So you can have, you really do want to have some raise on the turn.
He needs a diamond. Instead, it's the 9 of hearts. Doug is targeting a queen. He's going huge. 200,000.
The river question with aces, how do we want to play this? Do we want to check and trap, or do we want to bet and get value? I can see some pretty good logic both ways. Typically speaking, it's a little better to trap when you have a queen, because when you have a queen, it's more likely that he's on some kind of draw, or will turn something into a bluff. When I have aces, it's much more likely now that he has some kind of pair like king queen. Obviously, you can have ace queen, king queen, queen jack suited, or even just queen jack off in this game. Queen 10 suited, probably not queen 10 off. Maybe he gets really sticky with a hand like, you know, ace 9 of diamonds. Maybe he gets really sticky with a hand like ace 4 suited. That means that we're also playing the stand-up game, so he does need to make some like call downs sometimes. So, you know, there's not like a ton of hands that I think I get value from, but didn't raise the flop, didn't raise the turn. So I've got some reasonably good information about his hand. I think it's very likely that he has something like one pair, probably a queen X type holding. Yes, occasionally he will reverse head nines or queen nine suited, but I think we just have to kind of live with that and go ahead and value bet our hand. I think this river, you like 2/3 pot. I don't think this is a small river size. I don't think you like to block all that much. Basically, you're going to be doing a a portion of checking on this river and about 2/3 pot when you do decide to bet. At least that's how I would play it. Once you go big on a street, by the way, guys, just a good general rule, you typically don't start using small sizes later unless there's a board change. So if this river was the 9 of diamonds, a small bet would make sense. It would make something like 90k. But when it's the 9 of hearts, you typically don't like that size all that much. Okay.
And he's got a jack in his hand. Is he thinking of doing something awesome? He's thinking about it. This would put Doug in a very tough spot. Gotta believe his plan was to bet fold. This would be beautiful poker.
All in.
All in.
All in, says Hank.
So ace jack of diamonds here. It's a not great spot for you. I would fold, and I feel pretty good about folding. Having the jack of diamonds is nice because you block me from having jack 10 of diamonds, but I can have all the jack 10s, so I don't think that's too relevant. I mean, he hit both of his cards mildly okay to river bluff, but I just don't think that this is the hand you want to use. I think you need to block some kind of set, right? I think having an 8 here is really nice. I don't know what 8 that would be, like ace 8 of clubs, 10 8 of clubs. Those ones are really nice because you block me from having my main set combo, which is 8s. Then you also block the straights, the straight rather, and then you're less worried about the top set and the bottom of sets. So I think like if he had like ace 8 of clubs or 10 8 of clubs or jack 8 of clubs, I really like that as a bluff. Ace jack of diamonds, there's just not enough properties going for it that make me like it.
Wow. How much is it? Oh, it's like, I don't think I can.
You can't call.
Okay. Thank you.
This is incredible. Hank has had enough.
200 in and then.
What?
You have so many other hands. Fuck.
Doug hates folding,
I don't think I'm gonna be able to do it.
but you gotta believe his plan was to bet 200 and fold to a jam. Here's the jam. If he does call, this will be the largest pot in the history of Hustler Casino Live. Over $2
You turn something into a bluff.
million. Hank has not gotten out of line at all today.
I would rather have ace queen. I would rather have ace queen.
Of course,
Blinds this.
you'd rather have ace queen.
I can't really have that much better stuff.
Uh-oh.
Can you share what you have?
Really good players when they
I wish I knew
can't.
anything about you, Hank, other than we took a picture together last year.
When they can't have better stuff,
I'd rather have ace queen. Sorry, yeah, I'd rather have ace
they're
queen.
inclined to call.
Could have some occasional sets. Not that much stuff. Not that much stuff. Oh shit. I think I'm gonna have to occasionally put it in.
Wow.
Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I am going to 1 out of 4 times. I'm gonna call.
Wow.
So I got a heart and a spade. I'm gonna mix them up. If it's ace of hearts twice in a row, I call. Otherwise, I fold.
Wait, can I ask a question? Is that binding?
It's 100% binding. If ace hearts twice in a row.
You understand, Hank?
So Hank can show his hand now.
Guys, yeah, you guys.
Okay. Okay.
They're asking
So
for you.
Nick, here we go. Okay. So if you get spade, I fold. If you get heart, we do it again.
Can I do it?
You can go. Spade's a fold.
They're asking for no one else to be involved in this. I understand. They're telling me. I apologize.
Spade, I fold. Heart, we do it again.
I'm not picking you to pick.
I have to pick. Okay. Okay. Spades a fold.
This is amazing.
Fold.
Show him.
Fuck. Fuck.
Hank has something working for him here, which is when you rip this spot, most people just don't do that. They just don't really go. I mean, let's just think about this, guys. He has to have $1 million in front of him with a misdraw, facing aggression, knowing I can have a lot of good hands, and then just put in the million. I'm not trying to boil poker down to just simple stuff like that. We usually do a lot of advanced analysis on this channel, but to be able to do that, you're kind of in a different category of player, and I don't know Hank at all, right? He's just a guy I just met. You know, I took a picture with him last year, and now we're playing this pot. So when I don't have a read on someone like this, back to what I should do, I try to just play like what I think my optimal strategy would be. We've gone through the hands I can have. I can have some Jack 10 suited, right? If I 3-bet Jack 10 suited, which I'll be doing a good chunk of the time, I'm probably going to mainly bet the flop. And then if I bet the flop, I'm probably going to bet the turn a decent amount of the time. So I do have a good chunk of Jack 10 suited, or a reasonable chunk of Jack 10 suited to have the nuts here. I'll never have pocket nines because I'm not going to bet 2/3 pot on the turn with pocket nines. It's kind of suicidal to do so. So I don't have that. I'll occasionally have pocket queens, but you know I am betting the flop with queens a decent amount. And then turn I will be betting it some, but queens typically likes to check turn because you block too much of the value. So I occasionally have queens. I'll definitely have a good amount of eights. I'll have a chunk of Jack 10. And then the 4s and 3s I will occasionally have as well, although those are less likely because those hands mainly just fold pre-flop. Obviously I'm bet folding my bluffs, but he's betting $1 million here over a 200k bet. I can do a lot of folding for this price. He's risking 900 to win the 500 or whatever 600k. So I think I can fold my bluffs obviously. I do get to fold some value bets, and I think it's better to fold aces and kings. I think it's better to call with a queen. Because if I have a queen, it's less likely he has a hand like pocket queens or queen 9 suited. It's not a huge difference, but it's probably something. But you could argue that they're all quite similar. So the question is, how often do I have to call my aces? And I think that the answer is I can do a good chunk of folding. So maybe if I thought a player was really tight, I would always fold. I don't really play like that though. So I kind of just thought it over. I'm folding my bluffs. I don't have that many of the sets and straights. I do need to sometimes call my overpairs. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about as I go through this hand. It's funny, when he first jammed, I thought, oh, I'm obviously folding. And then I thought about it. I'm like, I think I need to call some of these hands sometimes. So I ultimately decided if I call a hand like this 25% of the time, mixed in with all the other stronger hands, that if my opponent is bluffing with just hands like he has here, that essentially I'll deny enough of his bluffs where I'm comfortable with the fact that his bluffs are not making money off me. Or rather, the bluffs are indifferent or maybe losing if it's a bad combo. So I decided 1 out of 4 times. I don't know, maybe another solver nerd can help me out.
You rang? So we didn't overlay our own commentary for the last few nodes because frankly we didn't have much to add to Doug's analysis. But we do want to step back a bit and break down his final thought process from a macro standpoint and explain how it ties back to the title of this video, How to Play Without Fear. Notice that after Hank shoved, Doug's immediate gut instinct was just to fold. As he noted, most players, particularly Rex, simply do not find sufficient bluffs in this spot. Hank's play was in a different category compared to some of the other big bluffs we saw during this series. It's one thing to have the initiative and then barrel off into a capped range filled with busted draws. It's an entirely different thing to bluff raise in the face of a polarized line, that 3-bet pre-flop, and then triple barrel through the river. Because in order for this sort of bluff raise to work, you have to cause the value portion of an uncapped nutted range to fold. There are many pros, perhaps a large majority, that would have just snap folded in this spot, facing $1 million river raise holding a measly 1 pair. It would have been very easy for Doug to simply decide that the pot was just too big, to convince himself that this spot is underbluffed, and to muck his hand with the hopes of finding a better opportunity down the line in this juicy lineup. But sometimes those better opportunities don't ever come, and quickly retreating in the face of aggression can turn into a bad habit. So Doug paused for a moment and recognized the fact that he didn't actually have any sort of substantive read on Hank. On the one hand, most of the wrecks in the $1 million games up until that point had been playing relatively tight given the stakes. But on the other hand, LSD Hank is Asian, and it could have been the case that he simply wanted to out-Asian the kid that ran a crazy bluff just the day before. Our point is, although it's true that every single player is imbalanced and can be exploited, the problem is it's hard to know which way they're imbalanced without a significant sample size. And if you don't know which way a person is imbalanced, you can't effectively exploit them. Not everyone is Tom Dwan, who can identify villains' exact combo by observing the way that they sit and deciphering how tight their butt cheeks are clenched. Additionally, when you rely primarily on reads and instinct to guide you, it can be hard to compartmentalize the money aspect. So if the stakes are high, fear can begin to encroach on your decision-making process. However, if you instead focus on the technical aspect, busying your minds with things like range construction and probabilities, this has a tendency to switch off the emotional part of your brain, allowing you to make reasoned decisions regardless of the stakes. And so it was fascinating to watch in real time as Doug pulled himself back from succumbing to his initial gut instinct, and instead he ultimately stuck to what had gotten him to that point over all these years: game theory. Specifically, Doug's decision-making process was structured by the application of the concept of MDF, or minimum defense frequency. As many of you know, MDF is a calculation that tells you how often you need to defend against a better raise in order to prevent your opponent from profiting by simply bluffing with any two cards. Now in practice, MDF can't be precisely applied to most situations because it's based on the assumption that villains' range is completely polarized and heroes' range is 100% bluff catchers, which is almost never the case. Additionally, technical application of MDF would require a hero to know exactly how many combos he has in his entire range, which is an impossibility for anyone that practices game theory because their strategies will be mixed. And this is definitely the case for Mr. All Options Are on the Table, Doug Polk. But one can still abstractly apply the principles of MDF to structure his thought process, which is exactly what Doug did here. First, he recognized the fact that he was allowed to do a lot of folding given the size of the raise relative to the pot. Second, he broke down his entire range that arrived at that river spot, which consisted of bluffs, value bet folds, and value bet calls. And finally, based on his pot odds and range analysis, Doug recognized that he would need to defend with some one-pair hands, namely aces, kings, and/or ace-queen, to avoid overfolding because he didn't have a sufficient proportion of nutted hands to round out his defense. Between those three, he decides that he would prefer to call with ace-queen, primarily because it blocks villains' pocket queens. However, the solver actually pure folds the few ace-queen combos it has in this spot. So what is the reason for this discrepancy? Well, this is because in this specific sim, villains' predominant bluffs are actually coming from top pair combos. Now this may seem crazy to some, but you have to put things in the context of the entire hand from pre-flop through the river. When Doug 3-bet pre-flop and then triple-barreled post-flop, including by using larger sizings on the turn and river, he was mostly saying that he had an overpair or better. Against that specific range, Queen X, and in particular Queen X weaker kicker, shrinks down essentially into a pure bluff catcher because it's unlikely Doug is value betting hands that weak. Recall that even back on the turn, Doug indicated that his cutoff for value betting 2/3 pot was king-queen. And putting aside card removal, bluff catchers accrue 0 or near 0 EV when they call. This in turn means that in order for a bluff catcher to transform into a profitable bluff, it only needs to produce a small amount of EV in that line. And Queen Jack and Queen 10 in particular have good bluffing properties because they block both Doug's pocket queens and his straights. Now all that being said, whenever we review a sim, it's important to step back and consider whether the assumptions the solver is basing its strategy on apply to our real life situation. If the assumptions differ, then we need to take the results with a grain of salt. And so, going back to Doug's decision, we need to ask ourselves whether we think it's likely that Hank is sophisticated enough to turn top pair into a bluff instead of just calling with them. If the answer is no, and his bluffs are coming from non-Queen X combos, which becomes more likely if Hank's actual preflop range was wider than GTO due to the stand-up game or otherwise, then Doug's EV maximizing strategy would likely be to prioritize bluff catching with ace-queen over aces and kings. But even if we assume Doug is correct here in terms of where Hank's bluffs are actually coming from, it's likely that Doug simply does not have enough ace-queen to defend with to meet MDF. If his cutoff for value betting on the turn was king-queen, then his cutoff for value betting large on the river needs to be elevated even further because the bottom part of the hijacked range strengthens when he calls. And so we see that the solver prefers to mostly use the block bet sizing in Doug's shoes on the river with ace-queen. So ultimately, after considering the size of the bet in relation to the pot and the composition of his entire range, based on all the action from preflop through the river, Doug estimates that he needs to call around 25% of the time with his overpairs, which ends up being quite accurate and is evidence of someone that has a strong understanding of his own strategies and range. So how does one play this game without fear? First and foremost, you must play within your means, which unburdens your mind from the risk of ruin. Then, you accept the things outside your control, such as the hands that are dealt and the cards that fall on the runout. You trust your preparation and focus solely on executing your game to the best of your abilities. This allows you to become detached, not just from the money, but from the result itself, which brings clarity. And in the history of poker, there perhaps has never been a better example of this in practice than a player in front of the entire poker world leaving a $2 million decision up to a random draw of the cards.